My next guest here on Emirates World was born in India, brought up partly here in the UAE, and now resides in Singapore. Along the way, he picked up a Bachelor of Science degree in International Affairs from Georgetown University, followed by a Master of Arts in Security Studies, also from Georgetown. Then, in 2010, he received his PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics. His name is Parag Khanna, and if I had to run through all his achievements over the past 10 years, we'd never get around to starting this interview. Parag has written a number of books on the future of global civilization, in which he discusses the impact of technology, transport, energy, and communications in the coming years. His latest book, published in 2019, is entitled The Future is Asian. Parag, welcome to Dubai again, and welcome to Emirates. The Future is Asian is the title of your book. First of all, I think big question, how do you define Asia? It's a very sort of movable beast, is it not?
It's a very big beast, and when you look at a world map, it's kind of the rump of the giant dinosaur known as Eurasia. And Asia is 2/3 of that Eurasian mega continent. In school, children learn that the continents of the world are North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia. Stop right there. Europe and Asia are not separate continents, right? They share a continent, right? There's a fluidity between Europe and Asia, but there's also vast chasms of empty space. If you think about Western Russia, the Ural Mountains, and that's considered one of the divides of Asia. You asked me, what is my definition? No one is entitled to their own geographic definitions. Geography is something that's quite sacred. And there is no disagreement about what the definition of Asia is. The Arabian Peninsula is the western part of Asia, as is Russia, as is the Anatolian Peninsula, also known as Turkey. So Asia actually stretches all the way from the Mediterranean Sea to the Sea of Japan, from Russia to Australia. That is the correct definition of Asia. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is precisely because every book about Asia in the last 20 years has been basically a book about China, with a couple of pages dedicated to the other 3.5 billion people who belong to the Asian region, which includes most Arabs. And so there's some big parts of this book that are about the Arab world, which is very much part of the Asian world.
So where does the UAE, since we happen to be in Dubai, let's address this particular area. Where does the UAE sit in all of this? Because when I come here, I don't regard myself as being in Asia.
Right.
In fact, the city, I would say, is more European or even American in terms of its
Well, Dubai is
look
very
and feel.
special. Dubai is the most cosmopolitan city demographically on the face of the earth, and indeed in all of human history. There's never been something like Dubai, and I've written a lot about it in previous books as well, how unique the circumstances are demographically. Then there's the geography. Let's remember that just because you are incidentally on the Asian portion of the Eurasian landmass, what's more important, of course, for Dubai is to be the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa at the same time. However, what is very significant, and you feel this very much here in Dubai, is that the demographics and the economics and the strategy making do tilt more and more towards the East, towards Asia. Demographically, that's been the case for 40, 45 years. My family moved here from India in the 1970s at the same time that Saudi Arabia and the UAE were rising, and that's how the majority of the population of foreigners in this region became Indian and Pakistani and broadly South Asian. Now, if you look at the trade, obviously the UAE's trade with China, with India, far surpasses its trade with other countries in the world. Then you see more and more the strategic ties, whether it's defense agreements, defense cooperation. All of these things are also now starting to pick up a bit. So I call this the Arab-Asian nexus. And Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, with their very strong diplomatic connections to the Asian powers, speak to how there is this Arab-Asian nexus that's deepening. And let's remember, I'm talking about a process that only kicked off a couple of decades ago. Eras of history last for centuries. And so when we talk about the new Silk Roads, it's a centuries-long process. We're in early days of something that is definitely a robust trend, though.
We've seen huge economies like India and like China have suddenly become modernized, suddenly they're not all driving around in 1952 Morris Oxfords.
I don't even know what that is.
You're far too young. But they, if you like, joining the 21st century in terms of communications, in terms of technology, and so on and so forth.
Really leapfrogged into it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Where's the state of democracy in some of these new emerging mega economies? Are they becoming more democratic, and is that necessarily a good thing?
Well, the thing about Asia is that it is the most diverse region of the planet, right? In terms of the number of countries, the number of ethnicities, civilizational, religious histories, and the types of governments that you find. You have monarchies, largely in this part of the geography. You have some of the gold standard democracies of Earth are in Asia. Think about Japan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand. Obviously, Australia and New Zealand have that British colonial history and parliamentary style liberal democracy that is inherited from outside the Asian region. But they are geographically in Asia. And let's remember, they have a very strong signaling effect. When people in authoritarian countries in Asia, or poor, undemocratic countries in Asia, see that the Prime Minister of New Zealand was unmarried and pregnant at the time that she assumed office, that has an impact socially. So the cultural nuances and vast differences of Asia notwithstanding, the fact that they share a geography means they see each other all the time. And I'm seeing these spillover effects psychologically promoting a greater liberalism. Doesn't mean that you have more democracy. That depends on the country. And to be blunt, because you did suggest this in your question, the question is that a good thing? As a political scientist, let me tell you, governance matters more than democracy. Democracy is a form of leadership selection, which forms part of how you run your country. It is better to be a democracy than not to be a democracy in the sense that you want to have the input of your people in some way, shape, or form. The consultation of the people is the bedrock of legitimacy. And even in many authoritarian countries like China, they will say that, we seek the permission of our people. We seek their approval. We seek to consult them in the decisions that we make, even if they don't get to go to a ballot box and vote. So there is something in human nature, that is present even in authoritarian systems. But I just want to emphasize this point, and I will do so over and over for the rest of my life. More people in Asia live in democracies than in non-democracies, right? India, Indonesia, Philippines, throw in, of course, Japan and South Korea. You're talking about more than 2 billion people who live in functioning democracies. They're not great democracies. It's not Westminster democracy. It's not Canadian democracy, but in bona fide democracies than in the whole rest of the world put together. So what I decry, is when people look at Asia, they look to the East, and they say it's that authoritarian Chinese zone. Remember that China is 1.4 billion people, and those 1.4 billion people do live under an authoritarian state, but they do not represent the 4.5 billion people of Asia. Most Asians live in democracies. They're proud of their democracies. They fight for their democracy, and they try not to be afraid of their leaders. The Filipinos, the Indonesians have been throwing out their leaders for decades, and it does them a great disservice to pretend that Asia is not full of vibrant democracies, because it is.
At the time of recording this interview, Parag, the newspapers are full of Huawei, the Chinese telecom firm, and the controversy over whether places like Britain or countries in Europe should allow the Chinese to build the 5G networks. We've seen the extent to which China is now investing big in Africa, building railroads and roads there. Even in Dubai, DP World, the ports authority here, own ports all around the world. What do you read into this huge investment? Oh, I forgot the nuclear power station in the UK, which is being built and funded by the Chinese.
That's right.
What do you read into this huge investment by Asia into the West?
It's all part of this process of reconstituting what I call in this book Afro-Eurasia. Actually, this is the term historians use to describe the pre-16th century geography of global trade. Afro-Eurasia. It speaks to its components, Africa, Europe, Asia, formed given the technology of the time, a fairly robust trading system. Now, in the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is that opportunity to bring back Afro-Eurasia. Europe trades more with Asia than it does with the United States. So the Western alliance is certainly still a strategic community, but it is not the most intense trade relationship in the world the way it was during the Cold War. Europe and Asia is the most dense trade relationship in the world, and that trade is growing significantly. By the way, it's already $1.6 trillion a year, and that's before Belt and Road, before the EU-Japan trade agreement kicks in, right? Before China gives reciprocal market access. And Africa, which used to be quite dependent on Europe and its former colonial masters, now trades much more across the Indian Ocean with China and India and other Asian states than it does with Europe, despite the geographic distance. So you're reconstituting this Afro-Eurasia. And remember that you can't have trade without investment. So when you think about the relatively low level of modernization of infrastructure in Africa, in many parts of the Middle East and elsewhere, that has to be modernized. It has to be built up. And what Asia has done in the last 20 years is to put in center stage on the global agenda infrastructure finance, helping the post-colonial countries of the world, which, by the way, is 150 countries. Most of the world's countries are post-colonial countries born after 1945 that have tripled their populations in the last 50, 60 years. Where is the new infrastructure? They need it. So China has been right, unquestionably correct, to put this on the agenda and say, and you know, the United Nations has made infrastructure one of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is a universal consensus that it has to be done. So, you know, not every project is the best selected, is done the most sustainably on the most, propitious economic terms in terms of the debt load. We know that. But is infrastructure the pathway towards countries joining global supply chains? There's no doubt about it.
Tell us about the new Silk Road. What is it, and where's it going to end up?
Roads, plural.
Roads,
right? So,
okay.
you know, the Belt and Road Initiative is actually just the latest installment in this 30-year process. Again, 30 years ago, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, this big blockage was removed. And so China was able to begin to invest in pipelines and railways all to the Caspian Sea and make plans to reach this West Asian region. The Indian Ocean trade began to flourish in the 1990s as India began its reforms as well. And so these new Silk Roads began to recover, if you will. Now, again, they're already flourishing. Like I said, the volumes of trade are incontrovertible. They are larger than any other trade relations on Earth already, even without the high quality infrastructure being fully in place yet. There are 4 or 5 freight rail lines crossing Eurasia. There could be 15 or 20 in due course. There are, 700 million people living in the European Union. There are 4 billion people in Asia. They do want to get more connected, and they will. And it's going to require more of these iron Silk Roads, as I've been calling them. But it's more than one pathway. The Silk Roads of centuries past, of previous eras, crisscrossed. There was not only east-west, and east-west meaning across the central parts of Eurasia. Now there's talk of the polar Silk Road. There's obviously the maritime Silk Road through the Indian Ocean, and many other kinds of conduits. North-south as well, by the way. From India through Iran, through the Caucasus to Russia is considered the north-south Silk Road. So the important thing to remember is that it's not just about what China wants and what China builds. It's everyone connecting to everyone else in their own mutual interest.
How important are raw materials in the future of Asian economics?
Very important. They have been, and they continue to be. I mean, China is the largest importer of commodities in the world and the largest exporter of finished goods like electronics and to some degree, some categories of textiles and other areas. And Asian countries certainly are as a whole. So for them, getting goods through the Straits of Malacca, which is a maritime choke point, or evading it by using overland routes is very, very important for their supply chain resilience, right? Not being too dependent on shipping through one narrow corridor. So raw materials are critical, but Asia itself is also abundant in natural resources that it has underutilized. So for example, if you look at the new gas pipelines from Russia to China, that decreases China's need to import natural gas from other places that are far away, like West Asian countries. So I think that you're going to see lots and lots more infrastructural connectivity in the raw material space that makes the trade and energy more efficient and brings down costs. And that's very important because for the largest Asian economies like China and India that are huge importers of raw materials, it costs them a lot of money. But when you have more efficient supply chains in closer geographies, you bring that cost down, and that's good for those economies.
We're sitting here in the middle of probably still the biggest oil producing region in the world. Is oil still going to be important as we move in further into the 21st century, or are we going to see the rise of electrical power, natural power, cars driven by batteries, that sort of thing?
The answer is yes, but it depends on how. And you can look at these things both geographically in terms of which parts of the world are transitioning away from fossil fuels. So Europe is, far ahead of the rest of the world in terms of the share of its energy supply that comes from alternatives and renewables. A number of large European countries like Germany already have grid parity, as it's known. So, they in a way can overproduce based on just alternatives and renewables. That's a very positive trend. But hydrocarbons, petrochemicals still matter in many ways. Even if we have reached peak oil demand, roughly 90 million barrels per day, and even if that it'll go down to 85 million. 80 million, 75 million, and so on. But petrochemicals still matter because they produce plastics and lots of other compounds and chemicals that we need for much of our built environment. So I think that it will still matter, but the question is how. And that's why, Saudi Arabia's reforms, and to some degree here also in the UAE, there's a lot of emphasis now on exporting more oil and doing more renewable power domestically so that you still generate the revenue from the oil exports, but you're using it to finance your own domestic transition. So,
as they have done here in Dubai.
A lot of people ask, why would, a lot of people find it suspicious. Why do Arab oil-rich countries want nuclear power? Is it because they want weapons programs? And the answer is actually more of an economic one, which is that if you have made that fixed investment in a nuclear power supply, you can export all your oil rather than using so much of it domestically, and you don't make any money off of that. So it's actually perfectly rational.
Parag, it's been brilliant talking to you. As always, we've spoken before. I very much hope we'll speak again in the future because it's always fascinating. It's always interesting. Thank you so much for joining us today on Emirates. And I'd just like to point you in the direction of Parag's brilliant book, The Future is Asian. And it's a fascinating read.
Thank you
so much.
A real pleasure.